Hello everyone, and welcome to the 119th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the characters and themes of The Last of Us Part 1. The Last of Us provides us with a story filled with moral challenges and dilemmas from all angles, presenting us with the horrid ramifications of a broken world filled with flawed people who are trying to piece it back together as best they can. Now, I've had several requests to cover Joel Miller in particular, but considering that this story is filled to the brim with characters and organizations who deserve to be examined under a moral lens, I figured it would be best to cover them all at once. So, in this video, we'll be discussing the moral implications of the actions of the Cordyceps, the US government and FEDRA, the Hunters, the Fireflies, and finally, Joel Miller. Now, because of how layered with moral ambiguity this story is, this video, while still being an analysis of these characters and institutions on a moral level, will for the most part be morally ambiguous as well. With that in mind, what I propose here are in no way concrete conclusions regarding any of these elements, and I encourage you to use this video as a platform to express your own views and opinions regarding everything I discuss in this video. Also, you might have noticed that I chose to focus only on The Last of Us Part 1 in this video. I did so because while I'm sure many of you watching this video played The Last of Us Part 1, I'm sure there are many others who didn't and only know this story because of the show, and with that in mind, they haven't yet experienced The Last of Us Part 2. So, to satisfy both parties here, I figured it would be best to tackle the second part of this story after it's been adapted to its show version. With that in mind, because the show follows the game so closely story-wise, what I say here is both applicable to the show and the game, and you'll be seeing clips of both on your screen as this video progresses. Now, The Last of Us is nearly perfect, but you know what it doesn't have? Our sponsor for this video, Raid Shadow Legends. You've all heard about Raid by now, and for good reason. A mobile game with console-like quality, there are hundreds of artifacts to equip, and over 700 unique champions from different factions with their own set of skills to collect, as well as tons of bosses to fight with those flashy moves. And with all of this and more, Raid offers you engaging gameplay with hundreds of hours of replayability. Right now it's time to celebrate, because it's Raid Shadow Legends' 4th birthday, and if I had to pick 4 champions to help give Raid an eldritch birthday bash, I'd choose Candrafon, Underpriest Brogni, Truoth, and the Walking Tomb Drang. 4 baddies that I've had my eye on for some time now. With such a celebration comes amazing gifts, free ones at that, as well as dedicated offers, promo codes, events, and a brand new fusion event where all of you can get your hands on an anniversary-themed legendary champion. You'll also be getting a recap video of your stats in Raid, and I'm looking forward to see how many champions I've pulled since last year. For Amazon Prime members who just got Gembo, keep an eye out for the next drop, which will include some savage gear from now until March 30th. There's no better time than right now to start playing Raid, and if you haven't started yet, click my link in the description or scan my QR code here on screen, where new players will get a ton of amazing bonuses, including the epic champion Kellen the Shirk, and other handy things like energy refills, magic potions, and XP brews. And since it's Raid's birthday, there are even more gifts to unpack. All new and existing players can receive a pile of free birthday gifts after they've clicked my link to get into the game, and you can do so by simply entering the promo code 4years Raid to get your hands on 4 legendary skill tomes, plus other useful stuff. So what are you waiting for? Join millions of players across the world in unleashing your horde of awesome champions in the world of Raid Shadow Legends by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking my link down below, and you can even join in the fight with yours truly by adding me under the name The Vile Eye. Thank you Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. To begin discussing the moral implications of a post-Cordyceps world, I think it's best that we briefly discuss the fungi that initiated this veritable apocalypse. Because I'm assuming you've all watched the show or played the game, I won't go into detail about the fungi itself, but I do want to provide a perhaps obvious answer to one question. Can we label the Cordyceps fungus as being evil? The answer to that is almost certainly no. While Ophiocordyceps unilateralis does horrible things to the body and results in the deaths of our loved ones, it's simply fulfilling its biological function, which is to survive by infecting a host and using them to reproduce. So to claim that an entity of base-level intelligence is somehow operating with malicious intent simply because it's reproducing is a stretch to say the least. What we can say, though, is that the Cordyceps evolution into a being capable of infecting humans has caused a whole host of morally questionable actions to be taken in our effort to survive this plague, and it all starts with the government, the military, and their successor, FEDRA. At the beginning of the outbreak, the United States was already taking drastic action in an attempt to reduce the spread, as we quite plainly saw when a soldier took Joel's daughter Sarah's life, and we can assume that every government across the planet took similar action. As in a situation like this, you've already essentially lost the first battle of a war that's going to ravage your entire populace. And at this beginning, it wasn't so much about saving people's lives as it was about limiting the spread of the infection. As far as morality is concerned, this is the grayest of gray areas. As what is the right answer here? What is an overreaction to this situation? What is the correct action to take? I think there are two ways to look at this dilemma. On the one hand, you can say that whatever course of action saves the maximum amount of lives possible is the correct action to take, no matter the moral implications associated with it. Let's examine this notion by using the example we're given in the beginning of this story, the murder of innocent people outside of designated quarantine zones to preserve the lives of those already confirmed to be uninfected. If you're in a position where you have no idea who is and isn't infected, unless you've ensured that to be the case, killing anyone outside of quarantine zones could be the correct thing to do and even morally excusable when you consider that your options here are limited. Even bombing population centers infected by this fungi, as Dr. Pertiwi suggests in the show, could be the correct course of action to take here. You could try and hold off on doing these kinds of things and attempt to save as many people as you can in these areas, but you have to wonder if that would end up hurting more than it would help. Would you be dooming the people outside of these infected areas, and those few who managed to escape to your safe havens, if you allowed others you're unsure of to enter them? Who knows? But this is probably the most extreme example of the old adage, better safe than sorry, and it could very well be that you're making what's left of the world safer by murdering innocent people. However, the other way to look at this situation is to adhere to moral principles absolutely, and claim that any innocent lives taken in the pursuit of potentially saving a larger group of people is unacceptable and inexcusable. Perhaps there are ways of containing the spread without resorting to drastic measures, and while it makes sense logically to take these actions, it becomes a much more sinister prospect when you're the one looking down the barrel of a gun, as it's much easier to condemn innocent people to die when you're the one doing the condemning. So the answer to the question of which is right and which is wrong is a very solid, I don't know, and it's up to you. Unless we had access to some sort of simulation where we could verify which option would save the most lives, we'll never really know which is the correct answer here. And lacking that confirmation, when you're examining these scenarios, you have to take into account the urgency of the situation. When you're in the middle of a crisis like this, you find yourself in a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. And it's only with hindsight that you're going to be able to take a step back and ponder whether or not you could have done something different. And as far as morality is concerned at that point in time, you have to be willing to forgive some of these spur-of-the-moment actions, because when there isn't time to think, well, there isn't time to think, and there likely is no right answer here. Regardless of what you think that right answer might be, the type of governmental action taken here is probably inevitable, and with that inevitability, you're given another, that being that whatever remnants of governmental and militaristic structure remain are going to take control with the superior logistics and firepower that's available to them, and continue this directive as long as necessary. Enter FEDRA, the Federal Disaster Response Agency, as the successor to, or rather remnant of, the US government and military. FEDRA has become the dominant power in the quarantine zones, which in turn are the successors to, or remnant of, the cities they occupy. Through the use of military power, FEDRA is able to impose order upon the citizens of these zones by any means necessary, including the advent of public institutions aimed at rebuilding society, like FEDRA military boarding schools, a job program, curfews to limit the spread, currency in the form of ration cards, safety from raiders and hunters, and even a judicial system born from martial law, where traitors to the system they've created are promptly executed in the name of stability. Now, in a scenario such as this, where the military arm of a government has been able to survive on life support and allied itself with the remnants of that government, it's all but inevitable that some form of tyrannical and militaristic governmental system would take hold once a relatively secure base of operations had been established. But again, we have to ask ourselves, is that the correct course of action to take here? Has FEDRA saved more people people than they've murdered. Would the majority of the people in the quarantine zones have perished long ago had they not been given a safe haven watched over by these protectors? Is FEDRA a necessary evil? The answer to these questions is a big old maybe, as the use of force to prop up some sort of societal order in the wake of society's destruction seems valuable enough to warrant the existence of FEDRA, as I do doubt that the majority of people living in these quarantine zones would still be alive had somebody not taken the initiative to put some sort of emergency system of laws and governance in place. However, that doesn't necessarily excuse the many crimes they commit in service to that system, and while an organization like FEDRA might be both inevitable and necessary at certain points in the apocalyptic timeline, especially towards the beginning of it, that doesn't mean their existence should continue, as by the time Ellie and Joel team up, FEDRA has become little more than a police state clinging to power, as so many other despotic regimes do, and while they may have served their purpose in protecting survivors and providing a foundation for them to re-establish society, the people under their care are now more than capable of deciding for themselves how they'd like to continue going about rebuilding the world, and they should be given the opportunity to do so. However, another thing to take into account here is that the few societies that have managed to thrive outside of the quarantine zones have probably been able to do so because the people who created them first managed to survive by sticking to a quarantine zone and then branching out to find their own path. Some didn't, like Bill, but I would imagine that the vast majority of survivors outside these zones lived in them at some point, so you have to give them credit for that. But regardless, like any tyrannical regime, they're more than open to replacement via revolutionary activity, which is where the Fireflies come in, but we'll talk about them a little later. First, let's discuss another revolutionary group, the Hunters, and the moral implications of being one. Hunters are the people occupying former quarantine zones who chose to rebel against both the Fireflies and FEDRA in an attempt to create their own system of government. In their hasty efforts to do so, they failed to see the implications of violently shirking off one's oppressors, or would-be oppressors, and they subsequently failed to achieve their ambitions because of their lack of supplies, structure, and resources. Because of this, they've essentially become bands of outlaws preying on anyone who enters their territory, calling these victims tourists, and killing them for their belongings, and in some cases, their flesh. Now, the Hunters have as much a right as the Fireflies to rebel against their government, and no one is going to blame them for providing an alternate option. But does your right to freedom and right to rebel against your government also grant you the right to murder innocent people for the sake of that freedom? I would be inclined to say no. If you've devolved to the point where your group of survivors are now a group of bandits killing anyone you come across because you've either failed at creating your own society, or you're not too keen on joining up with any others because you were either trying to escape them in the first place, or you fear the retribution that will follow once you attempt to, then you're essentially criminals no matter whose legal lens you're looking through. And this is perhaps the only group that we can definitively label as being evil in this story. Yes, when it comes to survival, it's every man's game to play how they need to play it. But when you rebel, fail in your rebellion, and then decide to kill innocents in order to sustain yourself, that's not actions taken because you're forced to do so in order to survive. Those are desperate measures born from your own failures and short-sightedness, and they are thus inexcusable. At any time, these groups could try their hand at forming societies a la Tommy and his group, or Bill, but they instead choose to keep raiding and marauding. Now, this is a group that we can call evil, and though all of them play their part, there's one individual in this story who we can categorically claim as evil for reasons even beyond his group's sordid ambitions, and that's David. David is the leader of a society of hunters who, unlike Tommy and Bill, have decided to keep to their raider ways, and to add an extra layer to the typical hunter behavior, they're also cannibals. Whether they choose to be cannibals when they aren't suffering from a brutal winter is unknown, and it could be that their choice to eat people is a hard decision they had to make, much like people stranded on mountains have had to make, and that would be just as excusable as that type of scenario. However, the fact remains that they're still raiders, and that David is a tyrant and an abuser. This is explored more in the show, where we see that David is a cult leader who treats his flock like they're his children who he physically and sexually abuses. And to make matters worse, David tells Ellie that he was a teacher before the world fell to ruin, which implies that he was probably hiding the monster he was long before he was driven to make hard choices in the name of survival. And I imagine he was living out his sick fantasies in his head as he was teaching his students, or perhaps even acting on those fantasies. David is the one personal example we're given of a horrible person capitalizing on the sorry state of the world, and his sordid behavior is a terrifying example of what evil men can do when they're given power, and how they take advantage of a ruinous world to play out their dark desires. And people like him can't be condemned strongly enough. Now the Fireflies, on the other hand, are the closest thing to a well-intentioned group of people that were given in this story, though they aren't without their faults as well. In their pursuit of a free society and a cure, I'm sure they've committed their fair share of atrocities. FEDRA as an entity might deserve to fall, but, and I've made this comparison before, if we liken their struggle to any other revolution, like say the American one, it wouldn't be fair to state that every British soldier fighting for the Empire deserved to die because they happened to be working in service to it. As though some of them may have been nasty characters who wanted to oppress people, most of them were just fighting for the institution that had provided them with a livelihood and security for their entire lives. The same could be said for FEDRA soldiers, and this type of violence and murder can be chalked up to the unfortunate byproduct of revolutionary activity, but it's not something that should be taken lightly. On the whole, though, the Fireflies seem to be one of the only morally sound groups operating in this post-apocalyptic world, and their attempts to return governance to what it was before it fell, and their efforts to find a cure, are admirable qualities. Where we come to a fork in the road regarding their intentions is their goal to use Ellie's resistance to Cordyceps to make a vaccine. In a similar vein to the military and FEDRA's use of violence to contain the spread and impose order, the sacrifice of one life to save many begs the question of whether or not it's the right thing to do. Now the answer to this question is probably yes, as the unfortunate reality that Ellie needs to die in order to save what's left of the world from a horrific apocalypse is far more beneficial than her death is tragic. However, there's a couple big issues here. One of those being that there is no way to guarantee that extracting the strain of Cordyceps that resists the virulent one from Ellie's brain here would allow Dr. Anderson to create a viable vaccine. And if it turns out that he can't, her death would be in vain. Even if the chances of creating a vaccine were slim though, it's still probably worth trying when you consider how monumentally impactful it would be if he did succeed in doing so. This is an incredibly tough decision to make, and it's one that I'm sure has actually been made by people throughout our history. But now we've come to another issue with the Fireflies' decision to use Ellie in their experiments. They didn't let her decide. Now it's not like they took Ellie kicking and screaming to her doom, and at the very least, Marlene attempted to lessen the burden on her by concealing the truth of her mission to Ellie, but that's still a very questionable thing to do, as Ellie is more than capable of making this decision on her own, and it's possible that she could have even offered some sobering alternatives to her own death to find a cure, and she could have allowed Dr. Anderson to perform any number of other non-life-threatening experiments on her before coming to the conclusion that the removal of the cordyceps from her brain was the only solution, at which time Ellie could once again make the decision of whether or not to go under the knife to save the world. Or she could have chosen not to allow them to do anything, and that would be fine too. She should be in charge of her own life after all. Whether or not the Fireflies would have chosen to operate on her anyway against her will is another matter entirely, and it's possible that they would have if she chose not to go through with the procedure. So that's something to consider as well, and perhaps that was something that the man who saved her life was considering when he decided to cut down anyone who was a part of this process. Now Joel, before he destroyed the Fireflies, was by no means a perfect person. Joel was a smuggler, a criminal in the eyes of FEDRA. When Joel is speaking to Tommy, he admits that he himself was a hunter at one point in time, and though we can assume that he acted as one in order to survive and didn't have much of a choice, he was a criminal in the eyes of the innocents that he murdered to stay alive. On his journey to bring Ellie out west, he murdered countless others, people who deserved it for the most part, but still, he is a seasoned killer with little to no mercy when it comes to preserving his own life or the lives of those he loves. And this designation, along with his attachment to Ellie and the memory of his inability to save his daughter, is what brings him to murder all these people at the end of this story. You've all seen the show or played the game, and you know that Joel's killing spree here was brutal and perhaps even heinous. But does that make Joel the villain of this story? Does this action, more than anything else he's done, solidify Joel as an evil man? Maybe. Maybe he had no right to kill these people. Maybe he doomed the world more than it already was. Maybe his murder of numerous relatively innocent people to save one girl who could have saved the world with her sacrifice was a veritable crime against humanity. Or maybe it's not quite enough to label Joel a villain. Ask yourself, how might you react in a similar situation? How many lives would you end if someone told you they were going to take your child's for any reason? Even a good one. This man, who was fueled by raw paternal instinct and the desire to save his surrogate daughter when he couldn't save his own, was caught in a crisis. A moment where the only thing on his mind was the impending end of a life that he had come to love. And so he took action. And gruesome as his actions were, they're understandable. And I'm not sure that they were enough to label him a villain. I think we can look at this situation and say that his actions might have been evil, but the man himself, I'm not sure. Irrational, misguided, traumatized. honest and emotional, yes, but not evil. However, Joel is guilty of the same sin as the Fireflies, depriving Ellie of her choice to use her immunity to save the world or not. She would never have been able to make that choice had he not saved her, but he also ensured that choice was taken from her once again when he killed the people capable of using her immunity to find a cure, and then again when he then spun his lie about the other immune people and the Fireflies' willingness to let her go because they couldn't find a cure, or in the game, because they didn't need her anymore. As with nearly everyone and everything else in this story, Joel and his actions are in a morally gray area, and when it comes down to it, The Last of Us presents us with a world filled with evil, difficult decisions, and the people who have to make them. People who have to make hard choices to save the ones they love, to preserve the future, to create a new one, and to survive. And though there are certainly plenty who were capable of condemning for their actions in this hellish version of our own world, there are many more who we could possibly forgive. And if anything, The Last of Us reminds us that we're human, and to err is human. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on The Last of Us? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who has decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.